resume.
Mr. Lapointe, I'm now going to turn to asking a few questions so that we can understand the role and importance of determining the peak in season and how that informs decision makers at that point of time. And I'd ask if we could have Exhibit 315, paragraphs 5 and 6 of Exhibit B of Ms. Michelson's affidavit. And Ms. Michelson is one of your more recent staff, 3 years now, I understand. She's been with the PSC and has been assisting you in understanding the risks and uncertainties associated with developing the in-season model. Is that correct?
She's been leading a substantial overhaul on the uncertainty part of our analyses. She's not just assisting.
She's leading.
Yeah, she's really, really helping.
All right, so then I'd like you to go to paragraph 6, and in particular, the sentence that's beginning, actually just before paragraph 6, you'll note that she's identified 6 uncertainties that this new Bayesian cumulative normal model that you're using to develop total run sizes in season, these are uncertainties. I just, first of all, before we, these uncertainties are calculated once the peak is observed. Is that correct? That's when the model applies.
No, there's uncertainty about all those things that are provided throughout the duration of the run. Estimates are made as soon as you have 4 or 5 days of observations. We can generate an estimate.
Oh, I see. Okay. So you're using that model as soon as you start getting information that informs it?
Yes.
All right. So all of those uncertainties are calculated into the model, and those uncertainties also apply at the time in which the peak is observed?
Yes, they apply before, during, and after the peak.
All right. Those are, thank you. That's useful in interpreting that list. And then in paragraph 6, she says 2 things, beginning with near the end, prior to observing the peak of the run. There it is.
Yes.
Prior to observing the peak of the run, it is very difficult to estimate the run size. The run can either be early or small or later and large. Would you agree with that? And is that a critical component of ensuring that ensuring more accuracy in the estimates of the run size that you're doing in season?
It's the archetypal dilemma that all salmon managers face, and graphically, if it helps to think about it, and maybe you don't want me to go into that detail, but we're comparing the observed data to what we would expected based on the preseason forecast. The curves that we saw yesterday that showed sort of the jagged dark lines and the smooth.
Yes.
If you see more fish than you expect early on, there's 2 possible causes of that observation. One of them is that they're earlier. Okay? See more fish than you expect. It may just be that the peak is going to be sooner, and that's why you're seeing more fish earlier. Does that make sense?
Yes. And
the other possibility is that the run's bigger, because that would also cause you to see more fish than you expect early on. So the dilemma that you have early on is which of those hypotheses is true. If the run is early, it could still be small. But if the run is large, so this is what she's referring to in this sentence. So it's the consequences of those 2 alternative hypotheses about what might be causing the data that you're seeing right now that she's referring to. The converse, if you don't see fish when you expect, it could be that it's a smaller run, or it could be that they haven't arrived yet. So that's the picture I'd like you to think about when you think about this sentence.
okay, and that's helpful, very helpful. Thank you. And then I just would wonder if this is a follow-up. Then is it a little bit more accurate just after the peak? Then.
Yeah. Once you see, so in the statistical jargon, we would say that the timing and abundance are confounded. You can't tell the difference between the 2 hypotheses early in the run. As soon as you see the peak of the run, once you know the timing, then all of a sudden, well, it's not early or late, it's this timing, and so then the uncertainty is about how big it is, and that uncertainty is diminished greatly when you've seen the peak.
And you need to see it falling.
Yes, it's not like you see yeah, it has to, in order to say there's a peak, it has to have gone down.
And that may take, in your 2 examples, that may take 2 more days.
No, it's more than that.
5 or...
So, as I said yesterday, just to help you again remember, is the spread of a run is about 30 days. So if the run came in just like the forecast, we'd have about 15 days of data before the peak was actually there, and then we'd have to wait another 3 or 4 days because you have to see it drop off, like you said. So it might be 18 or 20 days into the run before we've observed the peak.
And therefore, before you have a more reliable sense of the size of the run.
Absolutely, exactly.
All right, I'd like you to turn to document 7 on our list of documents. It's a new document. However, last night I learned and advised everyone that the document 7 that I listed was a draft document, and in Ringtail is the final document. And so I'm going to, and I understand there's no difficulty with that, I'm going to propose to put into evidence as an exhibit document CAN 043234, which is an article of Michael Staley. You're familiar with Michael Staley, and it was his review of the 2006 Fraser River sockeye fishery.
Yeah, Mike Staley's on the tech committee, so sure, familiar with Mike.
You've worked with Mike for many years, yes?
I've known him for almost 30 years.
Yeah. Perhaps for just as an opening comment, we don't need to get into a ton of detail on this, but why I'd like to use this document and present it as an exhibit, and perhaps we could mark it as an exhibit.
Exhibit number 335.
Is that it provides examples of in-season decisions that were made, and will you agree with me there were in-season decision made in 2006 with respect to a number of runs that were made before you identified the peak?
Yes, we made decisions about run sizes, provided advice about run sizes prior to the peak.
And that had implications in particular for the Quesnel run, is that correct?
Yeah, this is the return from that 2002 example I've been talking to you about for the last few days.
And the hope, Mr. Commissioner, is that in reading Mike's summary, it helps to educate Commissioner Cohen on the nature of the things that are going on in season in the minds of the people that are having to make the decisions and the complexities associated with that. And so if I could, I'd like to take you to, where's my page? No, page 9 of the report. And I'll take you to the paragraph beginning with the summer run. And if you could review those paragraphs and see whether they accurately reflect the description of what was going on, and particularly the times in which decisions were being made with respect to the Quesnel run and the implications. And you'll have to review page 9 and 10 of the document.
I can.
You're familiar with that season quite well.
I can go through it with you if you like.
So there were signals in July that the Quesnel run was in trouble, as Mr. Staley uses his words.
There were signals prior to July when I provided my review of the Fraser River sockeye forecast, the 2006 Fraser River sockeye forecast, which would have been probably in the fall of 2005. I was one of the individuals who flagged the issue of the small fry size that we talked about prior, and because I try to practice what I preach, I got out and tried to push the truck, as it were, to see if I could come up with another set of models that would provide an answer different than the preseason forecast. And I don't remember exactly what the preseason forecast was, but it was probably for Quesnel proper, something like 4 million, 5 million, which ended up generating the 7 million forecast for the summer on aggregate in total, which would include Quesnel, Late Stewart, Slocco, Chilco, and that's it for those 4 groups. So prior to the season, although we weren't able to come up with a better model that generated a different prediction, there's definitely wording in the preseason forecast document about concerns about the small fry size and the potential impacts on the return.
Okay, so we knew going into the season it was potentially in trouble, and the summer runs then began tracking late. Is that correct?
Well, again, that sentence there says tracking 6 days late, and the caveat would be they would have to be 6 days late in order to achieve the forecast abundance.
And at that point in time, the recreational fisheries were opened in Canada, the gillnet assessment fishery was planned, and low-impact fisheries were also initiated. Is that correct?
I believe there would have been July 28th. That's probably the correct documentation of the decision, yes.
So then
I don't recall the recreational fishery because that's not within our purview, but I do recall some low-impact fisheries. Probably it was the Area 5 fishery in the United States being triggered based on the in-season decision rules that we talked about previously.
Okay, and then we go to the next meeting of the Fraser panel, which is the August 4th meeting, and the summer runs have, again, in Mr. Staley's words, have not materialized in any abundance, and the early summer stocks appeared to be near the forecast abundance, although again late. The late Stewart and the Chilaka runs would have to also be late, but further fisheries are being planned in Canada and the U.S. The commercial trolls and the gillnets in the Johnson Strait are planned, and in the U.S., the larger, more effective fisheries near the mouth of the river were approved by the Fraser panel. So those are decisions that are being made before we're seeing the peaks of the runs. Is that correct?
August 4th would have been before we would observe the peak of those runs. I don't know what the peak ended up being at the end of the year, but that would certainly be before the peak.
And so then we move into the next week, the August 11th meeting. The in-season run size prediction models could be used.
That probably would have been the first time we made some sort of an in-season update, yes.
And what
I think
happens?
we moved to the 75P, as I recall.
So then these models suggested a lower summer run return?
The numbers in this document from these paragraphs on are inaccurate. They're not consistent with the minutes of the Fraser River panel. And if you'd like me to walk you through an example for August 18th, I can explain to you how these are not a reflection of what I said at the time and what was recorded in the minutes that are approved by the Fraser River panel, both the United States and Canada. It's a truncated range. It's incomplete.
Okay, I guess what I'm not so worried about the actual numbers, Mr. Commissioner. If you'd like me to do that, I can.
Mr. Commissioner, I am worried about the numbers because they provide the context of the interpretation.
What I was, I don't want to shut you down in any kind of way if that's important. I'm trying to have, and Mr. LaPointe, maybe you'll agree with me on this, there were large impact fisheries that occurred in August of 2006, prior to peaks, that had a significant impact, or had an impact on run sizes of the quenelle and the returns of the quenelle, that if you had waited until after the peak to observe the size of those runs, it would not have happened. Is that correct?
I would like to go through the record because you've suggested this provides an accurate characterization of the in-season decisions, and what I'm suggesting to you is that, in fact, it does not. It provides an inaccurate context.
Were the U.S. continuing to fish during the time this was occurring and prior to the peaks?
I believe that there were small, low-impact fisheries. And by this, I mean the Area 5 fishery. I don't have a strong recollection of the cumulative catch of that fishery, but it would be on the average of 700 or 800 fish a day during this time period. So there has to be some context associated with whether the summer run was 7 million or 8 million or 2 million relative to the magnitude of catches that were approved at that time that this document does not provide. I'm not proposing that I provide that context, but I do think it's important to provide the accurate estimates that were provided to the Fraser River panel as a basis for their judgment as to what decisions they made. You've indicated to the Commissioner that you think this reflects the way decisions are made, and I'm saying to you that it does not reflect it because the numbers that are in the document are inaccurate.
Okay. After 2006 and the management of the Fraser Panel decisions in 2006, has one of the practices been developed to resist opening fisheries prior to the observation of the peak?
As I said in describing one of the in-season protocols, we have a set of standards that we follow in order to determine whether fisheries are open prior to the peak, and it pertains largely to fisheries that have a fairly low impact relative to the size of the runs at that time. So I think that that protocol was followed pretty closely in 2006 as well. I think that the Fraser Panel was quite careful about the fisheries they opened. So I'm not sure the specific fishery that Mr. Staley is referring to in the U.S., the larger, more effective fisheries near the mouth river were approved by the Fraser Panel, or what the specific magnitude of their catches are relative to the total return. But I can tell you that the total returns that are reported in this document are inaccurate.
All right, well, Mr. Staley is coming to give evidence on frizzy, so I'll check his inaccuracies in this document to the extent it's relevant. Would you like to correct any particular number on this page that would help
I would like to
us?
provide an example if I could.
Sure, that'd be great.
The paragraph beginning at the August 18th meeting, where it says staff recommended staying with the 75P forecast greater than 4 million for planning purposes, even though the models were producing estimates that range from 2.5 million to 4.7 million. I'd like to bring up the minutes of the Fraser River Panel for that meeting on August 18th.
Okay.
I'd like to start with the first paragraph, where in the second sentence, I'm reminding the Fraser Panel about the situation with Quesnel, consistent with the advice that I provided on the forecast. Size of Quesnel smolts in 2004 was 2.01 grams, was very small, and may have contributed to the low marine survival. So I'm reminding them that preseason, I warned them that there could be a problem with Quesnel. So now go down to the next paragraph, where we talk about, that's the early summer run, so that gives you the range of estimates for the early summer run. So Mike's focused on the summer run, so let's go down to the summer run, which I believe is the next paragraph, Ben. So at the point of August 18th, there were about 1.1 million summer run that would pass, or estimated to have passed the marine areas. The paragraph goes on to provide the range of estimates that were provided to the Fraser River Panel. As I said to you earlier today, we always provide the full range of all the values that are from all the different models. There are about 3 or 4 different models here. So you can see the cumulative passage model generated 3 different possible estimates depending upon the assumption about timing. So consistent with what I was telling you, when you don't know what the timing is, you have to provide a range of scenarios because you don't know what the timing is. So they range from 3.1 million to 5.4 million. Other models were suggesting a potential total return. This is the cumulative normal model. It's fit to the distribution for the summer run of 5.78 million. The Bayes model, which appears to be the one that Mike focused on, did provide an estimate as low as 2.5, but also up to 4.7 million. So the actual range, go back to the document if you like, was 2.5 to 5.8 million. Staff advice was a 75P forecast, which is approximately 4 million. I don't know exactly what it was. If you take just the difference, so 2.5 plus 5.8, the average of those two numbers is about 4.2 million. So what we provided for advice was completely consistent with the range of estimates that we had at the time, and we stuck in the middle of the road. The 75P value was already about half of the preseason median forecast, consistent with all of the information that we provided. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up, Mr. Commissioner, is not to, although I believe it is very important to correct the record on this particular document, it's not about who's right or who's wrong. To me, this provides a fundamental example about what happens when all this context of change, the change I talked to you about when I first met you out at the mission site this summer, this is what can happen to a team when there's a lot of change happening. You get a lack of trust being developed, and I'm not saying anything about Mr. Staley's motivation here, but you get situations where this happens for whatever reason. And this particular document was done for an audience that it's just not helpful. It creates the impression of bias in the staff advice in the sentence in that particular paragraph, even though these models are producing estimates that range from 2.5 to 4.7, we suggested a number that was close to the high end of that range. I would suggest, and you can disagree with me if you would like, creates an impression of bias that was clearly not there in the information that we provided to the Fraser River panel at that time. So, consistent with my behavior from the time that the forecast was made until this day, and then you can go through all of these other paragraphs have the same issues. I don't think it's important to go through them in detail, but you have the minutes of the Fraser River panel for these meetings, every one of them, have this issue of incompleteness with respect to the run sizes that were provided.
So he didn't keep all the...
I'm not sure that, again, I'm not questioning the motivation, but clearly the range is not represented in the numbers that he's provided in this document.
Okay, so then let's go back to the issue of decisions that are made prior to the peak.
Mr. Commissioner, could that document be marked as an exhibit, given
Yes,
that it's been
please.
referenced?
Thank you.
Exhibit number 336.
Oh, actually, isn't this document, Mr. Staley's document, already marked as 335? Yes.
The minutes.
Oh, the minutes.
Let's
sorry,
talk about the
I'm sorry.
minutes, yeah.
I'm sorry. All right. What decisions have changed at the Fraser panel more recently? Of course, in 10 years ago and 15 years ago and longer, decisions were made prior to the peak to open fisheries.
And I'm not disagreeing with the fact that decisions were made prior to the peak in 2006. They clearly were. What I'm disagreeing with and what I'm trying to clarify for the commissioner is that the context of this particular characterization of those decisions is perhaps incorrect.
All right, and decisions that are made prior to the peak can have significant effects on stocks like it did for the canal in 2006. Do you agree with that also?
It is possible for those decisions to have an impact, but as I described to you earlier today, it's measured. The panel doesn't make decisions, for example, about having a large Johnson Strait seine fishery that might catch 1 million sockeye. It doesn't make that decision until it has sufficient in-season justification in its mind. Okay, I can't speak for the minds of the Fraser River panel, but they have to have sufficient in-season justification. If it's a Fraser panel approved fishery, have to have an assurance that there is indeed an available TAC. In other words, the use of the run size minus the escapement target, the run size that's adopted by the panel, minus the escapement target, minus the management adjustment, has to result in an available international TAC for me to approve any Fraser River panel fishery. If it's not there, I say no. And they have to go back and come back with another recommendation that for a fishery that would catch a magnitude of the catch that is consistent with the available TAC. That is only for the Fraser panel fisheries. I do not have the Fraser panel, I shouldn't say I do not have, the Fraser panel guidelines that are in the treaty only apply to the panel area waters. I have no formal role in the process of decisions on any non-panel water fisheries. That would include the Johnson Straits fishery, Aboriginal fisheries. All those fisheries are outside panel control. They aren't subject to the same decision rules of the panel water fisheries.
Thank you. But they are relying on your in-season run size
They
estimates.
all use the same run sizes, that's correct.
And it's clear that your run size estimates have a lot of uncertainties built right into them. In particular, the state-of-the-art one that is now being used has a whole list of uncertainties that we've just reviewed.
Yes.
And it only actually becomes accurate for understanding the peak once you've seen the peak and after the peak. You'll agree with me in all of those?
Yes, and I just would.
Would you also agree with me that it's useful in
Commissioner, he was in the middle of a sentence when.
I'm
Can he
actually
finish?
struggling with time. That's what I'm struggling, not with anything else. I'm sorry, Mr. Lapointe. I don't mean to interrupt you. You did some. Would you also agree with me that that might be a useful in-season decision-making tool or rule or guideline that would be used in a precautionary way? That's what I was thinking.
I'm sorry, I missed the first part of your question.
That decisions that would result in fisheries that would access runs would await the application of this model, which would await the application, the identification of the peak.
So if the question is, well, first of all, I need you to rephrase the question, I'm sorry.
The potential of large impact fisheries, would it be useful for as a guideline that large impact fisheries would not be opened until identification of the peak and the application of the in-season model?
I would say that the current practice is a fairly close characterization of the sentence you just said.
And so that practice...
I wouldn't say that there never have been fisheries that have been open prior to the peak, but I'd say that there's a degree of precaution that relates to the uncertainty of the information as it flows, where there's more precaution exerted by the Fraser panel prior to the peak than afterwards. There's a clear understanding that there's a relationship between the risk and the consequence.
Thank you. And again, I do apologize for the interruption.
It's okay.
Next place I just wanted to take you to is we have had a fairly useful dialogue around the management of uncertainties that are occurring, a high level of them. Would you agree with me that wiser decisions, and I'm picking up on the wiser that you used yesterday, Mr. Lapointe, wiser decisions are made when you have the decision makers reflecting a balance of understandings and impacts associated with those risks? So people have different risks in the fishery. You'll agree with me on that?
Yes, I agree with the last part of the sentence you just said.
And that when decision makers are, like the Fraser panel, which are a team of people, that decisions there will be stronger if there's a balance of decision makers and the weighing of those risks?
I think that decisions that are made with a full understanding and agreement and consensus about the objectives are going to be better decisions. And in the sense of the understanding of the objectives, if it helps to have, and I believe in it would, to have all of the folks that would be affected by those objectives agree to those objectives, then those would be better decisions.
Thank you. And I was just curious, you made a couple of observations yesterday about the difference between the U.S. Panel and the Canadian panel representatives, and that the tribes and the state in the U.S. are actively involved as decision makers. And in Canada, that's not your observation. But then you went on to make an observation that you were concerned that might not happen for the next 20 years or so. And in particular, that you thought that would only happen if treaties were resolved in Canada. And I was curious whether that's something you've been advised of, or is that something that's your assumption?
I was trying to provide a context for the difference between the two countries, and perhaps in doing so may have provided an example that, perhaps mischaracterized what I was trying to say. I think that the effectiveness and the reason that the United States has an effective representation is because they have a defined share, not just between Aboriginal groups and non-Aboriginal groups, but also within Aboriginal groups. So what I was trying to suggest is that to make the Aboriginal participation as effective and as it is in the United States would probably let me try to say this another way. The current capacity to be effective is limited by the uncertainty and perhaps associated disagreements with shares about both within and between. That's the context I was trying to make in terms of the representation. There's nothing in the treaty. In fact, there's articles in the treaty that talk about the need for whatever happens bilaterally to be consistent with Aboriginal rights. There's nothing preventing Aboriginal groups from participating, and there'd be a clear value from a broader participation. We have started in the last 3 years, as you probably know, a listen-in line, so that Aboriginal folks from all over the watershed can listen in on all the Fraser River panel calls. There's a call-in line, they can call in and listen. So there would be a value from a knowledge perspective and from a participation perspective to be involved. But in terms of, I think the context of the question I was being asked, and you can help me remind me, was in the context of whether the Fraser panel should be empowered or responsible for all those decisions. And my context of my response was that I thought they'd be ineffective at it because of the lack of agreement about how that part of the catch and so forth would be shared, which doesn't exist in the United States.
So let me see if I've got this right. That is something you've been advised by Canada of, that in order for First Nations representation to be
No, I've not.
present on. You've not been told that treaties are necessary.
No, I have not been advised that at all. It was just my attempt to provide an example.
And your observation is that what we need is the people that are measuring uncertainties and risks present. That's what's needed actually at some of the decisions that are made at the Fraser panel in assessing what models you're going to use and what decisions are going to be made in season. A broader team would reflect that broader representation. Is that correct?
From my perspective, I think the important thing is that we communicate those uncertainties and risks. From the decision maker's point of view, and the difficulty I'm having, and part of the difficulty I'm having in answering your question is that in the context of the treaty, it would be Canada's responsibility to ensure that all of the players that are important to Canada's decisions, because remember, we're talking about decisions on Aboriginal fisheries which don't involve the United States. The United States is not involved with those decisions. Yes, they use bilateral information, but they don't. The bilateral decisions are not made about non-panel water fisheries. So I think it would be up to Canada to decide what level of participation would benefit its decisions. From our perspective, we want to make sure we make that information accessible and understandable so whoever it is that wants to be engaged in those decisions can be fully engaged in those decisions.
And those decisions include measurements of risks and assessments of uncertainties.
Absolutely.
And
the implications of them and the consequences of them. Absolutely.
And that different people and different views and different fisheries measure those differently.
Absolutely.
On a allocation of the amount of fisheries that you're going to receive, is it?
Perception of risk related to allocation? No, not necessarily.
And so it wouldn't necessarily have to wait until the allocation issues were resolved. Is that correct?
The capacity of Canada to obtain input from all its players about risk does not necessarily require that the allocations be settled.
Thank you. All right. I want to turn to a couple of follow-up questions I had around your observations on the challenges with the late summers, some
Sure.
of which are pooling, and Mr. Woody's concerns and how they were borne out. As I understand the concern is that it would be precautionary to harvest abundant summer runs in a way that reduces or eliminates the impact on the late stocks, and in particular those that are pooling at the mouth of the river. Did I understand the evidence correct on that?
So, not sure the pooling at the mouth of the river is correct, but let me see if I can restate it and see if we've got a consensus on this in terms of you and I on this. So, the issue is that late run sockeye and summer run sockeye are mixed together in virtually all the places they're harvested. One has a very significant conservation issue with respect to late run sockeye that requires a, different than normal average approach to their management. The past practice has been to have a much lower available harvest on late runs, a much lower exploitation rate on late runs. Whereas the application of Canada's escapement policy would result in a much higher exploitation rate on the summers to reach the escapement targets in both cases. So if they are mixed together and one stock has a very low allowable harvest and the other one very high allowable harvest, then clearly the stock that has a lower harvest, in this case the late run, is going to constrain the ability to catch the available harvest on the stronger stock, which in this case is the summer run. That is true throughout the migration of these fish, not just at the mouth of the river. There has been some discussion about protecting the mouth of the river a little bit more intensively because that happens to be where the late runs hold. But even if we're talking about fisheries in the marine areas, Johnstone Straits, you still have this mixture of stocks. So it's not, the conservation problem is pervasive throughout the migration of these stocks, not just at the river mouth. In every fishing area, from the first fisheries, the most seaward fisheries in northern Johnstone Straits, all the way up until primarily, I guess the late runs would stop migrating. They would peel off at the Thompson. So the Adams would peel off at the Thompson and Portage would peel off at, so above those confluences, there would be no more late runs. But everywhere else, there would be late runs and summer runs mixed together throughout their migration.
All right, so it would be actually at that confluence that if we were trying to ensure that the lates had segregated out from the summers.
Upstream of that confluence, they would be segregated out primarily. Yeah.
And that would actually be a place where the fishery would be the most precautionary then, is that correct?
That would be the place where the most selective harvest of summer runs could occur, would be upstream of the confluence of the Portage, Seton, where the Seton Dam spills out into the Fraser there, Lillooet, I think it is.
Great, thank you. If I may make sure I've got this correct, you gave, in answer to Ms. Baker's questions around mixed stock fisheries, I believe, if I've got it right, but let me see, I'm not sure if I've got who asked the question right, but here's the issue.
I want to help you out.
Is that, as I understand it, you thought that we didn't necessarily need to go to more segregated out fisheries if we had access to better data in the marine, in particular, as I think I heard you say, instantaneous DNA data that would tell us quite quickly the mixed stocks. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I also suggested to Mr. Leadham about the possibility of another alternative that could perhaps accomplish the same goal, and that was just to lower the overall exploitation rate in the mixed stock areas to the level that's sustainable by the weakest link, so to speak, the weakest stock.
And I just wanted to just be clear that we don't have access to that type of DNA data right now, and it is quite expensive, and we won't have access to that in the short-term time frame, right?
No, and I know you're limited in time, and I don't want to take too much of it, but I just think there's a context here that might provide the reason that I'm, kind of careful about this, and it kind of relates to the importance of place. And I think that the importance of place in all fisheries, and perhaps it's best understood in Aboriginal fisheries, the concept, and I can relate to this because I'm a fisherman, and I have places where I fish with my dad that are important to me whether or not I have a rod in my hand or not. And I'm sure folks are familiar with the Aboriginal situation of, I can't imagine how much more it would mean to me if I was fishing on the same rock that my father fished on, that his father fished on, and his father fished on. Well, I think there's this importance of place that's attached to commercial fisheries as well. That's an important value that folks have. And so this is maybe going a long way around here, but it's not the entitlement part of that, not, and I don't mean that in an Aboriginal right sense. It's the value attached to those locations, not just the allocations, that I think in moving forward and thinking about options, we should be respectful of, in the sense that if there are solutions that don't require, that could be made, that don't preclude, that don't sort of ignore that value of place, that could be accommodated by other means, then it's keeping everybody on the bus, so to speak. We're not saying this location has no future in Fraser sockeye, because by doing that, I think it's we're missing out. We're missing out on a possible member of the team. We're missing out on information that could be valuable. And so it's not really about, who's fishing where and trying to defend the interests of somebody fishing here and somebody fishing there. It's just providing some equal respect to that value of place that a prescription, a geographically prescribed solution rejects. And fundamentally, I don't think the fish, the problem, the mixed stock problem, for example, has a clear geographic prescription. The example that we talked about just now, above the confluence of the Lillooet, yes, that's an opportunity. But what about all of those folks that fish below the confluence of the Lillooet? Are we going to tell those folks that they have no future because the only way to accomplish this objective is to only fish above? And I know that's not what you're saying, but sometimes it's characterized that way. Sometimes it's characterized in a very exclusive way, that the only way to solve this problem is by a particular geography. And I just suggest to you that A, is not what the fish are saying. There are other options, and the one I provided, I agree, is unrealistic in terms of where we are right now. But it keeps all of the ideas, all of the team, so to speak, in the same room, because they may have some pretty valuable perspectives. And so I'm sorry I've taken more time than I should, but I just wanted to provide you some context for why I use careful words about that, not just because I'm a member of the Salmon Commission and I'm walking this fine line of neutrality. It's because I really believe that all of those folks, all of that place part is really important. And if you carry it to the extreme, what about the Marine First Nations? Is there importance of place for those? So,
Mr. LaPointe, I thank you. If there's, what I'm hearing you say is that in finding solutions, we need to consider all of those that have historically, aboriginally, quite Dave, and in a modern context, have a relationship to the fish.
yes.
And thank you for that observation. Could I just, it was important to make sure the record is clear that the recommendation or the suggestion you made of having the DNA sampling in season right at the mouth is, I just heard you say, is unrealistic right now. That's not something. And
Costs
so
about $20 a fish right now.
Right, and so that one of the interim steps that might be useful is to become a little bit more flexible on how we manage the fishery, and not so attached to thinking that that's how we'll manage it in the future, but that until we have that type of data, it may be extremely useful to become more flexible on where we hold those fisheries, and staying flexible into the future. Would you agree with me on that?
Yes.
All right. I need to go to Policy and Practice Report number 5 again, and I just needed you to help us with some language
it's
on
okay.
this one.
Okay.
If we could go to paragraph 45, and I'm going to go to the second sentence. Management of Fraser sockeye salmon assumes that exploitation rates on each stock are the same for all stocks within the group.
Yeah, that's incorrect. I don't know what the context of that sentence is. It might refer to the assumptions about if you model an aggregate group and you apply an exploitation rate, it's assumed to apply equally to each of the stock groups. But in fact, as I talked about yesterday, when we're monitoring in season, we have more than the 4 groups. We have sometimes as many as 15 groups. So in fact, it's conceivable to estimate the exploitation rates for however many DNA reporting groups that we have, which varies by year, but can be as many as 15. So I'm not sure what the sentence was intended to mean about management of Fraser River sockeye assumes that the exploitation rates on each stock group are the same. We certainly understand that the sustainable exploitation rates could vary across each of the 19 stocks. It is true that the Canada's escapement policy does aggregate those to 4 stock groups, but at developing those harvest rules, it is, and you'll find out more about this later, I guess, when the Frizzy folks come, but it is, those harvest rules are sensitive to the exploitation rates of the 19 stocks, because there are benchmarks that measure things like the probability of that aggregate harvest rule what are the implications of an aggregate harvest rule for, say, the probability of a stock falling above a benchmark and so forth. So
this is.
I don't know how to rephrase that sentence in a way that helps the record because there's a lot of subtleties here. I'd be happy to try to, spend some time perhaps, but I'm trying to provide sort of different contexts in which exploitation rates come up in productivity, in actually monitoring what they are, and so forth. So
that sentence is not correct, and we'll take steps to try to see if we can correct it, or at least we now have it on record that it's inaccurate. And then I also wanted to take you to the next sentence, and it says, however, depending on each stock's production, each stock within an aggregate can theoretically sustain different rates of harvest.
Yeah, and that's consistent with what I just finished saying.
That's not accurate either.
That's consistent. That is accurate. That's consistent with what I was just saying. That statement that each stock within an aggregate can theoretically sustain different rates of harvest is in fact correct.
Okay, but can I then add that it's not only that they can sustain, they're also exposed to different risks within different rates of harvest.
The level of risk to future productivity on a stock would be related to the level of harvest it could sustain, among other things. So that's certainly one of the considerations, yes.
Thank you. How does, and I just need to understand at the end of the sentence, it may be important for you to read all of paragraph 46 so you get the context.
Sure. So,
and my question is how do managers assume conservation and harvest rules developed for an aggregate consider the weak stocks in that aggregate?
So this comes back to some of the comments I made yesterday, and I'll just provide the one example, and that is one of the ways that this would be represented in the harvest rules would be in the cap, the 60% maximum total mortality. Okay. That's one example. And this paragraph seems to be referring to me mostly to the development of the escapement policy, because there's the 19 stocks that are part of that model and they're aggregated into the 4 aggregates. So I think the way that it would be, the best example I could give you would be the one I provided you.
Okay, and I'll pick that up again with the Frizzy modelers then. Thank you. I have 2 remaining topics of questions. One is just a couple of very brief questions on this topical question of over-escapement and delayed density dependence, and then I have a couple of questions with you around the postseason run sizes.
Sure.
If I'm correct, the delayed density dependence that's being measured right now is on the next year after there's been a lot of spawners on any particular spawning ground. Am I right in that?
So it depends upon the stock. They try to measure the delayed effects. Typically have, I think there's 4, like the 4 years of the 4-year cycle are included. So it's we talked about this yesterday, and I thought we had a good example going with one of the other council that I'm trying to remember now to help, because this topic is one of the most
perhaps, and again, we're going to spend a lot more time on it.
Yeah,
I just needed to understand, are they measuring delayed dependency over a 4-year cycle?
Yeah, it's over
an 8-year cycle, over a 12-year cycle? We're just down at
normally the models that are measured that are used can only detect anything in the 4-year cycle, beyond 4 years. And there are some stocks for which those signals are only apparent in the first couple of years, and there's some that are more. So it just depends upon the particular stock as to whether there's evidence of delayed dependence across the 4 years or just over 2 of the 4 and so forth.
Thank you. And you'll agree with me that the benefits of biodiversity, for example, and the longer-term benefits of spawners into an ecosystem would likely need to be measured over a much longer period of time? Is that correct? Some
might be. I don't know that the sort of sockeye-centric benefits that I talked about before, like within the sockeye, you'd necessarily need to go beyond 4 years. But if you thought about things like delivery of carbon and nitrogen from carcasses, I don't know how long those nutrients would persist in the ecosystems for the forest, for example, but there could be some things that would persist longer. I think there's probably a range of things that persist, like most ecosystems, a very short period of time, and some might persist longer. I just not as familiar with all of the different ecosystem impacts to think about those long-term examples for you, but maybe the forest one is one.
Great. And then, as I understood it, what is the challenge is either competition for food and or capacity of the spawning habitat, and is that correct?
So when you say the problem, you mean the mechanisms for the delayed density dependence? Is that what you're...
Well, if you're beginning to identify delayed density dependency, what I heard you say yesterday is that there may be difficulties with food in the lakes.
Common hypotheses are competition for food. Another one is the impact on predators. And the predator idea is if you have a very abundant run that has a bunch of offspring and the predators do really well, when the next runs come and they're lower, those predators that have become more abundant may impact the subsequent runs. So predation and competition are the two things that have been proposed as the primary mechanisms for that phenomenon.
And again, I'll just leave it. Let's turn now to the postseason run sizes.
Sure.
And I from the outline of evidence that we were provided, one of the questions you were going to answer is why is postseason run sizes so important? I wanted to ask you, how has it become more complex? And are they becoming more accurate or less accurate from your perspective?
Okay, so on the importance side, did we touch on that a little bit on the productivity impacts and stuff, or did you need more on that? When we were talking about the DBE, I was talking about the implications of postseason run sizes for the data sets, for the forecasting, for the frizzy models and so forth. Was there more examples that you wanted on the importance side, or did you want me to turn to the second part of your question?
I'm actually, perhaps let's just turn to this question, which is, how are they becoming more difficult?
Okay. The second part is the one that you'd like me to focus my answer on. Okay, good, thank you. I didn't want to spend any more time repeating myself. Okay, so there's a number of ways that one might say they're becoming more difficult. The first is that we've had a larger fraction of the total run, and it's more important in some stocks than others, and some of the graphics that I provided yesterday on the early Stewart and Weaver give you two examples of that DBE, the size of that red bar relative to the other bars. There's an example of where there's another challenge in the run size that was never there. No, I shouldn't say it was never there. It wasn't there as systematically in the past as it is now. It's become the magnitude of that difference between estimate has become a much more important factor in recent years. A second difference, and I don't know if it's making the estimates necessarily more accurate or less accurate. It would probably depend upon your perspectives on the accuracy of catch estimation and escapement estimation, but the ratio of the magnitude of the escapement, so now I'm talking about the size of I can't remember which color was catch, the blue bars and the green bars on that chart, that ratio is also changing, where where historically, say, 70%, those 75% exploitation rates that we're talking about, what that means is 75% of the total run was in catch, and 25% was in escapement. If you go to a 30% exploitation rate, it would be more consistent with kind of the recent year, or even some lower years, then now all of a sudden you have 70% of the run being in escapement and 30% in catch. So the ratio of the components of that total run in catch and escapement is changing. And as I said, I don't, intuition-wise, and probably my first cut at thinking about this, I would say that probably those big catches were estimated, more accurately than we have in the escapement. There's perhaps more certainty in the catch than there is in the escapement, but I would open that up for some discussion. I wouldn't provide it as a concluding remark. It would just be my so that could mean if you're putting more fish into escapement, there could be a decreased accuracy, but that's not that may be a state of what could be true now, but it's not necessarily, insoluble and so forth. You could increase the accuracy of the escapement and achieve this same accuracy of the total run is what I'm trying to say. So
Okay, so then maybe if I could ask 10 yet, is that correct, at the final postseasons? And I was just wondering whether that is a good example of some of the challenges that are associated. As I understand it, you typically give the postseasons to the Fraser panel in their January meeting. That did not occur this year, is that correct?
yeah, but it's not typical. The reason that we don't have postseason run size for 2010 is that the folks that are involved with completing the analysis for the spawning grounds are under a huge challenge because of the numbers of the amount of data that they had. So it's not a, as we all know, last year was a great return, but it's not a very frequent occurrence. And most other years, they would have the capacity to get those numbers to us in January. This is the first time I can remember in recent memory that we haven't had preliminary escapements at least by January.
Okay, so part of it's just capacity. We're asking for more data. We're using more data. We need more capacity to gather that data in order to complete that. Is it?
Well, I guess that it's a combination of what the fish did, which was not very predictable, and I suppose that you could make the argument that if we had, twice as many staff, we might have gotten an estimate out sooner. It's kind of a, one of these. As a manager, I'd be asking myself, well, if I only need that staff once every 100 years, maybe I wouldn't provide a strong justification for someone to give me the money to do it, but in this particular example.
All right, so then what I'm also curious on is, as I understand it, the in-season estimates for this year's run size was around 34 million in-season, is that correct?
34.5 was the final panel-adopted run size, yes, that's correct.
And is it your understanding that that's going to be decreased in the total tallies, or do you know that yet?
The reason for that, the reason that there's a perception or perhaps information that might suggest it would be lower is the final adopted postseason run sizes for the late run were based on the models at the time, and I can't remember what the late run component is of that, but it's something like 24 million of the 34.5. We then estimate, so this is based on a model fit, the kind of stuff that Catherine described, a fit of a model to the data.
Yes.
We then estimate the fish at mission, and if we estimate the late run at mission, the abundance at mission is about 20 million or so, and so it's about 4 million less than the model estimate, and so that's where that perception comes that the run might be lower. So it's a in-season accounting based estimate, so to speak. I provided that information to the panel in October when we were at the Adams River, and they decided that since we hadn't seen the spawning escapements yet, that they'd rather wait on the final, change the run size once was kind of their call on it. I didn't make a recommendation, but I just advised them, looks like we might end up lower, and so they decided to wait for the spawning escapement numbers, and we're still waiting.
And do you know when it's likely we'll see those?
We've been told that we should get them around the time of the February meeting, which starts on Valentine's Day.
Great. Those are my questions, Mr. Commissioner.
Mr. Commissioner, we have two more counsel who would like to cross-examine Mr. Lapointe. One, Ms. Chavez has estimated 30 minutes, and Ms. Fong has estimated 10 minutes. We could potentially ask Ms. Fong to start now and see if we could get that finished before the break, or we can come back at 2, whatever you would like to do.
I think I can only speak for myself, but I'm sure Mr. Lapointe would like a break at this stage. So
Right.
Let's take the lunch break now.
Thank you.
Hearing is now adjourned until 2 p.m.